In this beginner tutorial, we're going to be making a calculator with PyQt. There's links down in the description for the finished code, as well as an article covering everything that we do in this tutorial as well. So let's get started. To make sure that you can run everything in this tutorial, you're going to need to install PyQt 5. I've got a full tutorial on how to use virtual environments, which is what I am using to install PyQt 5. If you know how to work with a virtual environment, all you need to do is do a pip install PyQt 5. And that should get you everything you need. As you can see here, all I really have is PyQt 5 in my virtual environment. But let's get to the code. I've already started by copying in some base level code that is used in most of the projects that I work on. It's just there to create an application and a window. So let's go through it line by line. So starting off up here, we just have a couple of imports, including some things from PyQt 5-.qtWidgets. I'm importing a Q application. And if we go down to the bottom, we can see here that we have an if statement just checking to see if this is the main file that we're running from. And if so, we're calling the main function. In this main function, we are creating a Q application and a main window. So this main window is an object of a class that I created. This class inherits from QMainWindow, and this is just so that we can customize it to be what we want it to be. And all we're doing in this class is we're overriding the init method and calling the super for it so that it runs all of the QMainWindow's init code, and then creating a title for the window. And that title is my calculator. If we go back down to the def for main, we're creating a Q application. We create the main window. We run window.show to show the window, and we execute the application. And if we run all of this code, what we're going to get is just an empty window that says my calculator on it. So let's do that right now. So we're going to go Python main.py. Because I have named it, let's see if I can type Python, Python main.py. And you can ignore the errors. Those are just some stuff going on with my system, but they're things that you shouldn't see. But as you can see here, we have a main window that says my calculator on it, and it's empty. So let's start by putting some stuff in it. We're going to start off by putting a label on the window. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to import QLabel. This is a widget. Widgets are things that we can add to our GUI. So they're things like labels, buttons, checkboxes, or more complicated things like lists and tables. But we're starting out with a QLabel. So let's add a QLabel to our window. So we're going to do self.label is equal to QLabel. And I am going to make the label say hello world. And then to add the label to our main window, what we need to do is we need to do self.set central widget, and we're going to do self.label. Great. And that's all we need to do to get the label added to the window. So let's go and run this again. And as you can see here, we have a window with a small label in it. So as you can see, a label is just something that labels. So it's usually text or an image. Obviously, in this case, it's text. So let's go back to the program And let's start adding some other things. So how about we add some buttons? A main window can only have one central widget at a time. And so what we need to do is we need to have one widget that will encompass all of the widgets that we want to work with. And so one of the things that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to import a QWidget. And we're going to do we're going to do widget equals QWidget. So we have our empty QWidget. So this is the main class that all of the different widgets that PyQt has inherit from. And we're just going to use it kind of as an empty container to be able to add a bunch of widgets to it. But to be able to add widgets to it, we need to set a layout. What layouts do is they set the rules for how the widgets interact with each other and where they exist in the window. So two of the simplest widget layouts that we can use are the QVBoxLayout and the QHBoxLayout. The QVBoxLayout is for laying out things vertically, and the QHBoxLayout is for laying out things horizontally. And so we're going to start out with laying out things vertically. So let's import in the QVBoxLayout. And let's create one. So let's add some buttons in a row as a starting point for our calculator. And let's have that label that we already have be above it. So what we're going to do is we're going to use both the VBox and HBox layout. The VBox layout is going to lay out our widgets vertically, and then we're going to have an HBox layout that is going to lay out our buttons horizontally. So our main layout is a VBox layout, not an HBox layout. It's a VBox layout because we want to lay out the label on the top, and then under that we want to have a horizontal row of buttons. And so we have the main layout as the VBox layout, and we're going to need a horizontal layout for the buttons. So we are going to have button, we're going to do H button layout is equal to QHBoxLayout. So let's add some buttons. So we're going to have some imports for buttons. So QPushButton is what we're going to import. And then let's create the buttons 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so we have our 3 buttons, and we have our VBox layout and our HBox layout. So we want to add these buttons to this horizontal layout so that they are all next to each other in a row. So we're going to do H button layout dot add widget, and we're going to add the 1 button. We're going to do the same thing for the other 2. Okay, so we have all of our buttons created and added to this horizontal layout. So right now we're going to make the main layout that is used by the central widget, which is now going to be widget instead of the label. And we're going to have the widget set the layout to the main layout. And we're going to add the label to this layout, because we have the main layout is a vertical box layout, and we want the label to be the first thing in there, because that will mean that it'll be on the top of the window. So we have main layout dot add widget self dot label. And then the next thing that we want in a row under it is going to be our row of buttons. And so what we're going to do is we're going to add to the main layout a layout. So main layout dot add layout, and we're going to add to it the HButton layout. Okay, so to talk through this one more time, what we have is we're starting out with a vertical box layout. That means that when you add a widget to it, it goes from top to bottom. And so the first thing that we've added to it is the label, the Hello World label that we have here. And the next thing that we add to it are the buttons layout. And so the buttons are laid out in an HBox layout, so that means that they will be laid out horizontally. And when you add the buttons, they add from left to right. So we've added button 1, button 2, and button 3, where button 1 is going to be far left, button 2 is going to be in the center, and button 3 is going to be on the right. And this is all going to be below the label. And so we add, and the way that we get the buttons to be under the label is that we add it to the main layout. We created our widget because we need to have one single widget that is the central widget for the window. And so we just add to the widget, or we set on the widget what the layout is. And so we're using the main layout, which is that vertical layout that we talked about. And then we add that widget as the central widget. So let's see what that looks like. So if we run this, this is what we get. We get the label and the 3 buttons, 1, 2, 3. The crazy thing is, these are all of the widgets that we're going to need to be able to create a calculator. So let's take a look at what the final calculator is going to look like for us to be able to plan how we're going to develop the rest of this. So here is what the final calculator looks like. We have a lot of buttons. This looks very similar to the calculator that you'll find on an iPhone. So it's got all of the operations that can be done on the right-hand side with orange buttons. On the top, it has the label that is going to tell you what buttons are being pressed. It has a AC button that clears the label, as well as all of the numbers, as well as a decimal point. So, for example, if we do 9 times 5, and hit equals, we should get 45, which is what we do. If we hit the AC button, it clears. So what should be the first thing that we do? So let's figure out how to get the buttons to actually respond and do something. So to start off, I'm just going to show you how we get buttons to react when we press them. So, and let's start out with just button number 1, and let's make button number 1 just update the text of the label to set it to 1. So what we're going to do is we're going to do one button dot clicked. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass it a function that it should run when the button is clicked. And so we're going to create a new function called self.buttonPressed. We're just going to leave that there. Notice that this doesn't have parentheses after it. That is intentional. Let's actually create that function. So we're going to go def button pressed. And what we want to do is we want to update the label. And so the label has a method that we can use for that. So we've got our self.label here. So let's do self.label.set text. And we're going to set the text to just 1 to prove that it's working. And yeah, let's test it out. We run, oops. Yes, I forgot one thing. It's clicked.connect. So it should be one button, clicked.connect, and we connect the clicked signal to self.buttonPressed. So let's try that again. Okay. And here we have our button. And if we press the 1, we would expect that this label is going to change to 1. And it does. Great. So we have our button changing that label and reacting to the button press. So how about we get all of the buttons to react to button presses? We could have one method per button, but if you look at our example, that's a lot of buttons. It would be a lot of methods to have one method per button. So we're going to get around that with a little bit of fanciness. So what we're going to do is we're going to use something called a lambda. And don't get scared of this. What a lambda really is it returns a function. And so what we're going to do is we're going to pass the connect a lambda, and that lambda is going to call self.buttonPressed. But the fancy thing with this is we're going to pass this function one button. What this means is that when this one button is clicked, it will call button pressed, passing it one button. This is so we pass the button so that we know what button is calling the button pressed function. So I'm updating button pressed to include the button. And so what we're instead going to do for setting the text is we're going to get the text from the button. So we're going to get rid of this and we're going to do button.text. And so if we run the code right now, which we can, we should get the same functionality. So if we press the 1 button, we get a 1. But let's update the other 2 buttons so that they get the similar functionality. So I'm just going to copy and paste this twice and replace 1 button with 2 and 3. Okay, and that's all we need. And if we rerun this, you can see that if we press 1, yeah, it replaces the label with 1. If we press 2, it replaces with 2, and 3, it replaces with 3. And you keep clicking these, and it'll just update the label's text. Great. So to get closer to what we want to do with the full calculator, why don't we add more buttons? Why don't we add the plus button as well as the bottom row, which is the 0, the period, and the equals. That way that we can start testing with a minimal amount of buttons to be able to do some quick operations. So what we're going to do is we're going to quickly add another button. So we're going to add the plus button. So all we need to do is create a new button here, do plus, and then let's just add it to the horizontal layout that we already have. So this is going to be plus button, and let's add our signals slots, plus button and plus button. Great. And if we run this right now, we can see that we now have the plus button here, and we can click it and it'll create pluses. Cool. Let's add the next row of buttons. So we're going to be adding the buttons for the 0, the period, and the equals. So to do that, we're going to add a new row. And to get a new row, we need a new HBox layout. So we're going to create that. So bottom row layout is equal to QHBoxLayout. Okay, so we have that. Let's create the buttons. So we can just copy some of this up here. So we need 3 buttons. We need the 0, the period, and the equals. 0, period, and equals. Now that we have the buttons, we need to add them to the layout. So we're just going to, again, copy from up here just to make it easy. Because I am lazy and I like staying lazy. So the layout that we're adding it to is the bottom row layout. And we are going to add the different buttons. So the 0 button, the period button, and the equals button. And then we want to have our button presses. So we will add the 0 button, period button, and the equals button. And let's add them so that they pass the right buttons to the right function calls. So yeah. So to recap, we have created a new HBox layout for the new row that we're going to have. Then we created the 3 buttons that we're going to have, the 0, the period, and the equals. We then added the buttons that we just created to the row layout and added that layout to the, add that layout, the bottom row layout, to the main layout so that that row is vertically under the most recent row. And then we need to have these functions for calling back connected. And yeah, we can run it now and we should have the next row of buttons. And as you can see here, we're missing a button. So let's see what's going on. Oh, okay. I forgot to fix one. Oops. I meant to say the equals button. We needed to add the equals button here. So let's try that again. And rerun it. Yep, great. We have our next row of buttons. You will notice that we don't have the nice alignment that we do with the calculator. So, or the finished calculator. So you can see that the 0 aligns with the first 2 columns. We will fix that in the future, but for now, just don't worry about it. But as you can see here, we have all of our buttons, and if we click our buttons, you can see here they are updating the label as we wanted them to. So let's do some basic addition with the buttons that we have here. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off by, instead of having the label have its text cleared every time we hit a button, we're instead just going to append whatever the thing is that is clicked to what is already in the label. So what we're going to do is we're going to do new text is equal to self.label self.label.text plus button.text. And then we're going to set the text of the label to be the new text. This way that we take whatever the text is of the label currently, and we add it to whatever the text of the button is that we have, and we set that combination as the new text. And so if we run it here, we can see that we start off with hello world, and we can click the 1 button, and hello world has a 1 after it now. But let's clear out hello world now that we're dealing with numbers and actual addition. So I am going to set the label instead to start with 0. So if we rerun, we can see that what we get is it instead showing 0. We can click 1, and we can actually add a plus sign and 1, and then we can hit equals. Well, what we want equals to actually do is to evaluate what we already have. So we don't want it to print equals here. What we want it to do is we want it to do the actual addition of these two things to evaluate what the text is of the label. So let's update the code to do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to put an if statement here. So if button.text is equal to the equal sign. So if we have the button as equal sign, so if the button that we pressed is the equal sign, what we're going to do is we're going to evaluate what is in the button, or we're going to evaluate what is in the label, and then we're going to set whatever we evaluate in the label as the new text. So new text is equal to string of eval self.label.text. And we're going to make an else for the rest of the situations. With that, we should be able to run it, and we should be having addition working. So we can do 1 plus 3, and if we hit the equals, we get a crash. Because evaluating with a 0 in front is not allowed. Okay, so we need to do some special casing of this. Just give me a moment and we will fix that. So if you look at a regular calculator, so let's look at the example that we have. When we start off, we have 0 as the value. If we press a number, it doesn't just add 9 after it, after that 0. So it's not 0, 9. Right now, it's just 9. So we need to have that similar functionality for ours to work correctly. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a new if statement that is going to handle this case of if we just have 0 as a value. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a new variable we're going to call operators. And we're going to set that equal to equal and period. Cool. And what we're going to do is we're going to check to see if the button that we're getting the press in is in operators. So else if the label text dot self dot label dot text is equal to 0. So we want to handle to see. So if the label is currently 0 and we're pressing a button that is not an operator, so basically it's just going to be one of the number keys. And now the only operators we have are equals and period. So we're going to check to see if the button dot text not in operators. Actually, we're going to make that all caps because this is a constant. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to replace what is in the label. So it's just going to be next text is going to be equal to self dot, or is going to be button dot text. And let's see what happens. So we've got the window, and if we click on one of the operators, it crashes. And that was because I can't spell. It should be new text, not next text. Okay, let's try that again. So if we press on, if we have the label as 0 and we press on one of the operators like plus, it clears it. Okay, I made a dumb error. We were supposed to have in operators plus and period, not equals. Yeah, so if we run it now, you can see that we can start off with 0 and we can add something to it. 0 plus 1 is equal to 1. Yay. But if we do it again, we can start off with 0 and just click on 1 and it just replaces it. So we can do 1 plus 3 and that equals 4. So great, we've got a super basic calculator that can work with the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 0. And let's see if it can work with periods. So decimal points. So we already have 4, so we can do 4.0 plus 2.2, and we can click equal, yeah, and it works with periods. Great. So let's recap what we have with this function so far. So the first thing that we do is we basically say, if you hit the equals button, try to evaluate whatever is in the label at the time. And if we look at what we have so far, you can see that like what you could do is you could just have the numbers and the operators in your label, and it just evaluates that. The evaluate function is just a function in Python that goes and evaluates whatever the text that is passed to it as if it was Python. Meaning you could have a print in here, you could have whatever Python code that you want. In this case, we're just using it for doing simple calculations. So the next bit is we have this else if, and this is just to handle so that we don't start numbers with 0. So if the label starts with, or if the label is currently 0 and we press a number, basically anything that isn't an operator, we've defined operators up here as plus and period, then what's going to happen is that it's going to replace the label with whatever the button is. So that's new text is equals button dot text. And lastly, for every other case, all you do is you just add on to whatever the text of the current label is. So you have label.text plus button.text is our new text, and set that as the label's text. So let's make what we have a little bit more pretty before we move forward. So if we look at what we're trying to emulate right now, one of the things we're missing is that we are not coloring our buttons. So let's do some coloring of our buttons. So let's try and set the plus button as having an orange background. Qt has an idea of style sheets. These are similar to CSS, cascading style sheets, if you've ever worked with doing some web development. What we're going to do is we're going to use these style sheets in order to set the background color of the button. So let's set the plus button as orange. So we're going to scroll up to where we created the plus button, which is up here. So yeah, we have the plus button created here. So why don't we set the style of the plus button? So first we need to set what the style is. So we're going to create a constant called orange style. And we are going to set it to this specific string. I'm copying it because we're setting a specific hex code. So you can set the background color of a button by setting the style with the background color name here. So we can do background color, and then we can give it a hex code. We can also give it just a named color. There's several named colors. You can go and look them up in the Qt documentation. There's like red, white, blue, light gray, etc. I didn't like the orange that they had, so I decided to go with a hex color. And so you can go look at this and you'll know that it's orange. So we have our constant for orange style, and we're going to apply that to the plus button. So if we take the plus button dot set style, we can do orange style. And let's see what that ends up with. Oh, set style sheet. Sorry, it's supposed to be set style sheet. Great. So yeah, if we set the style sheet, it'll work. So yeah, now we have an orange button. Great. So let's set the equal sign to it while we're here. So we are going to copy and paste this, and I'm going to move it down because we don't have the button for equals defined yet. So we can grab this and we can set it there. So it's equal sign set style sheet orange style. And then if we run it, we get orange. Great. We are closer to our final calculator that we want. So one of the other things that I want to prettify before we move on is, as you can see here, we have the label aligning over to the right instead. So the 5 is here instead of it aligning left. By default, labels will align to the left. So let's set the alignment for the label. For us to do this, we're going to have to do a quick import first. So we're going to be importing Qt. So from PyQt5.qtcore import Qt. So we need Qt because we need to get at some of the constants that represent aligning to the specific way that we want to. So we have our label up here. So we are going to do self.label.set alignment. And we're going to do qt.align vertical center. So we want it to stay aligned vertically center. So we don't want it to be at the bottom or at the top. We want it to stay vertically center. And then we also want it to align to the right. So we're going to do qt.align align right. Yeah, align right. You'll notice here that there is this bar here, and that's the OR symbol. So if you've ever done any bitwise operations before, you'll have seen this before. And what it's done here is it makes it so that it does both of these at the same time. So you don't really need to know much about bitwise operations. Just know that when you're dealing with setting constants and you need to put them, if you need to put two together, then what you need is you need to put this or symbol in between the ones that you want to put together. So we're doing align vertically center and align right. So if we run again, we end up with it aligning to right, which is what we want. And it still works. Let's do a little bit of code cleanup before we move along. We're going to be moving the constants to the top. That is pretty standard practice, is to put them below the imports. And you know they're constants because they're in all caps. Great. Much cleaner. One of the next things that we'll want to do is we'll want to add the rest of the buttons. So we've still got a lot of buttons that we need to add. This is what it currently looks like. And this is what we want it to look like. So we need to add like the AC button and then all of these extra 3 rows that we haven't implemented yet. But before we do that, there's also one more thing that we should probably do. If you look at our code currently, we're doing a lot of the same operations. So we're creating a button, and then we might be setting a style on it, and then we have to add the widget to the layout for that button, and then we have to add that whole thing to the main layout, and then we have to add all of the connections, and we basically do all of those operations for each of the buttons. And this is a lot of repeated code. And having a lot of repeated code that is the same over and over again is generally a bad thing. You generally want to keep as little code as possible while still maintaining readability. So what we're going to do to make it so that we have a lot less code is we're going to take the same operations that we do a lot of, and we are going to make it into a function. So we're going to make a function for setting up a button. So I am going to go down here, and we're going to create a button, or we're going to create a function called setUpButton. And what that button is going to do is it's going to take in whatever we want that button to be called. And so that button is going to, or that's going to be the text for the button. We're going to need the layout, and we're going to need the styles. So we're going to have the layout and style. Not all buttons are going to have styles, so we're going to set it to none if it isn't provided. And so what we're going to do is we're going to steal the code that we already used and add it. So let's take the creation of the first button, and we're going to copy it to setUpButton, and we're going to take the text and we're going to replace it. So we have button. So we've created our button. So one of the next things that we do is we style the button if we need to. So if style, then we're going to set the style. So let's copy what the style is. And so we set the style here. Cool. And we're going to set the style. And we're going to make sure it says button. So if there is a style, we're going to set the style that's provided. The next 2 things we need to do is we need to deal with button clicks, and then, yeah, let's do button clicks right now. So we're going to copy here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to get the button. When it's clicked, we're going to call button pressed. So we've got that set. And the last thing that all buttons have is that we need to add them to the layout. So we pass in a layout, and so we're just going to do layout dot add widget, and then button. And that's everything you need to do for a button, at least for the setup. So let's replace all of the setup of our buttons to use this function. So let's start off with button number 1. So what we're going to do is we're going to do self._setup button. And then, so the text for button 1 is 1. And the layout is going to be the QButtonLayout. And button 1 doesn't have any style. So it's just going to be that. And then that's it for button 1. Let's do the same thing for button 2, 3, and 4. Or plus. 1, 2, 3, and plus. So 2, 3, and plus. And with the plus, we need to set the style to the orange style that we already have. And now we can just get rid of all the code related to setting up the original buttons. So we can just delete all of this code. And we could do the same thing for the other 3 buttons, the 0, period, and equals. So I'm just going to copy the first one that we have. And what we're going to do is we're going to do bottom row layout. We're going to replace that. And we're going to take this and replace the 0 with the 1. And we're going to do that for the other 2. So the period and the equals. So we have period here and equals here. And then we want to make sure we set the style sheet for equals to be the orange style. And then we can remove all of that extra code. So as you can see, that got rid of a lot of code. So instead of having 12, 13, 14 lines of code to set up 3 buttons, we instead have 4. So let's see that it works. And it didn't. So let's figure out what's going on. I know what happened. I got a little too overexcited in deleting all of that extra code. So let's bring some of it back so we can find what we missed. Yeah, this is the thing that we missed. Copy this and get rid of all of that again. The thing that we forgot is that we didn't add the layouts to the main layout. So we needed these 2 lines. So now we have each of the horizontal layouts added to the main layout. Let's try this again. And there you have it. We have all of our buttons back, and we have a lot less code. So let's make sure it still works. 1 + 1 is equal to 2. Great, it works. So I'm going to go into a speed round and add all of the rest of our buttons that we don't have yet. So we're basically going to end up adding these 3 rows. So the one that starts with 4, so 4, 5, 6, and minus 7, 8, 9 times, and then AC, and then divide. So I'll go ahead and quickly do that, and we'll come back and I'll show you what it ended up with. We're back, and we are on the home stretch now. So if we run the program now, you can see here that we have all the buttons that we want. We have all of the operators, so we have all of the new numbers as well as the AC button. And the AC button is colored a little bit differently, so it's a little bit of a darker gray. So let's look at the code that I used to make this. One of the first things that I'll note is I created a new gray style. So this is similar to the orange style. So it's just the text that says background color. And this time I'm specifying the color as light gray. And I'm saying light gray instead of using a hex code for it, because Qt provides light gray already specified. Something new is I'm setting the color to black. So color for a label will end up being the text color. So I'm setting it black. I'm doing this because on some operating systems, by default, the numbers aren't black. And so if you're working on something like a Mac, you might need this for you to be able to see the numbers over the light gray. I also updated the operators, so I included the new operators that we just added, so minus, times, and divided by. And if we go down, what we can see is I have new lines for each of the different rows. So I create a new layout. I set up each of the different buttons. So for the AC, I have it with the new layout and the gray style. For divided by, I have the new layout and the orange style, etc. So I do that for every new line of buttons. So we have 7, 8, 9 star or times, and then we have 4, 5, 6, and minus. And that gets us what we have here. And you can see here that you can do operations 9 times 8, and you get 72. Unfortunately, the AC button doesn't work as we would expect. So the AC button is generally there for clearing. And so we're going to need to update the button press call so that it does the right thing. So let's go down here. And what we're going to do is we are going to add another if statement in here. So we're going to just add another elif here. Elif. And that's going to be button.text is equal to AC. Then we're going to do new text. New text is equal to 0. And if we run that now, it should do the right thing. So we can do 8 times 9 is 72. And if we hit AC, it clears it. So we've got that working. So this gives us a pretty simple calculator that just works. You can do a lot of operations on it. And it's cool. But there are some things that aren't perfect that would be nice to make it a little bit more perfect. If we compare it to the reference calculator, one of the things you'll notice is that not all the buttons line up as nicely. So you can see this AC takes up two column spans, and then this one takes up 2. But like here, like each of the buttons take up a third, and that just looks weird. And it just looks better to have them all line up in rows and columns. And so what we're going to do is we're going to change up how we are doing the actual laying out. So the way I showed you right now is just using the very, very basic things that you're going to use all of the time in Qt. So those QVBoxLayouts and QHBoxLayouts. And so what we're going to do is we're going to switch to using a QGridLayout. And what a QGridLayout lets you do is it lets you specify when you add a widget to the layout where it should be positioned in rows and columns, as well as how wide or tall it should be in your column span and your row span. So what you can see here is in our example, we have this AC button and it takes up 1 row, but 3 columns. So 1, 2, 3. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use our QGridLayout, and we're going to say, okay, this AC button is going to start off at this number. So the label is the first row, and so, or the 0th row, because in computer science, we always count from 0. And then so AC is going to start off on the first row. And so it's going to start off at the 0th column, and it's going to go for 3 columns long and 1 column high. So let's get to the QGridLayout and I will show you this. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove the QHBox and QVBox layouts because we're not going to need them. So we need the QGridLayout. And what we're going to do is we're going to set the main layout as a QGridLayout. And just as an example, we're going to start off with just doing one of the rows of the buttons as well as the labels. So I am going to comment out all of the other rows except for the row of the 7, 8, 9. So we have our QGridLayout set. We no longer need this layout. And we can just pass in the main layout to this function. And so if we go down to where we do the setup, we are going to update how we actually add the button to the layout. So one of the things that we're going to need to do is when we add the button to the layout, we need to specify the row, how many rows, or what the row is, and what the column is, and then the row span and the column span. And so we are going to pass those now to the setup button function. So we're going to do row, column, row span, call span. And by default, most of these buttons are going to have a row span and a call span, or width and height of just 1. They're only going to take up 1 row and 1 column. So I'm going to make them default to 1, just to make this it so we don't have to specify every time if we want to. So we're taking in the row and column, so where the button is going to be placed in the grid, as well as how wide and how tall it is. And so let's update our calls to the function. So we're passed in the layout, and now we need to say how many rows. So the label first will start off at row 0, column 0, so the top left, and then the label we want it to take up all 4 spots. So if we go and look at our example, then you can see here that the label takes up 1 row, but it also takes up 4 columns. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So we need to give it 1 and 4. So it's going to take up 1 row and 4 columns. And so for button 7, 8, and 9, we're going to pretend that it's going to be taking up the first row. So, and each of these are just going to take up 1 column. So it's going to start off at row 1 and column 0. And it's going to take up 1 row span and 1 column span. And we're going to keep doing that. So it's the same row, so row 1, but this time it's column 1, and it's going to take 1 row and 1 column. And I am just going to copy just to make it quicker. And so this one is going to have a column of 2, and this is going to have a column of 3. So there we go. So if we run this code, what we should see is we should have the label, and that label should be taking up 4 columns and 1 row. And it should start off at 0, 0, so the top left. And then for here, the number 7 should be on the first row, and it should be at column 0, so it should be at the left and take up 1 row and 1 column. And then similar for each of these, so the 8 will be at row 1, column 1. The 9 will be at row 1, column 2, and the star will be at row 1, column 3. So let's run it and see what we get. Yep, we get this. So yeah, the label takes up the first row, and then the 7, 8, and 9 are on the second row, and each take up 1 column. So let's apply this for the rest based on our example here. So we're going to want the AC to take up 3 columns and the divide to take up 1. Everything else should take up just 1 row and 1 column, except for the 0, which will take up 2 columns here and here. So I'm going to go speed through adding each of these and updating it. And then we'll go back through the code talking through to see what it looks like now. And we're back. So if we run the code that we updated, we finally get a calculator that looked like the example one. And we have the really nice alignment here. So let's look at the code and to see how it changed. So all that changed is we just added the setup button command to have the extra parameters that we needed to pass to set what the row and column was. So the label we already set previously. For AC, we had a row of 1, we have a column of 0, a row span of 1, and a column span of 3. And that is because, as we talked about before, the AC takes up 1 row and 3 columns. And then the divided by symbol just takes up, is at row 1 and column 3. And you can see that I'm not specifying the row span and the column span because by default, the function down here sets them to 1. And we keep on going. So we had the 7, 8, and 9 that we did previously. I updated those to row 2 because AC and the divided by symbol is now taking up row 1. And so each of those buttons just takes up 1 row and 1 column. And we do the same thing for 4, 5, 6, and minus, and 1, 2, 3 plus. And then the only another tricky one that isn't just 1 row and 1 column is when we get to the bottom and we want to set the 0 to take up 2 different columns. So we have the 0 and its position is 5, 0. And then the row span is 1, so it only takes up 1 row, but it takes up 2 columns. And that gets us to where we have the example. And now you have a really nice calculator that you can work with. It's not perfect. There are some things that you will find that could be fixed up about it, but for a beginner project, this is pretty great. It's something that is extremely usable, and it shows you the basics of a lot of the things that you're going to use time and time again with PyQt. So buttons, labels, being able to connect those buttons with functions, and being able to lay things out and to be able to update labels. And that's it. So thank you for watching. If you got value out of this video, consider hitting the like button. It helps the channel a lot. If you want to see more videos like it, please consider subscribing. I try to put out a new video every week. If there's a specific video that you want me to do a tutorial on, please put it down in the comments. I try to read all comments. And like with all software made to work on movies, we test in production. See you around.